Yes.
Okay. Okay, I can't see me on the big screen. Okay, so welcome everybody. This is Campaign for Truth and Iron Anti-Semitism. It's our first webinar, so please forgive us if we've got a bit of a time lag and a bit of a chat going on in the background. So I'd like to just say that Ambrosine and I would like to welcome you to this first webinar. As you know, those of you who know us, Campaign for Truth and Iron Anti-Semitism are both grassroots organizations, and we work in collaboration with each other. We trace and promote the understanding of major issues relating to Israel, the Jewish diaspora, and the Middle East in particular. We also track, monitor and anti-Semitism on social media, and we deal with the police, we report to the police, and we help victims as well. Our activities include counter-protesting, anti-Israelism, and we protest anti-Semitism wherever we find it, and we hold demonstrations and we run events. Our events to date have been live in halls, and this is our first time that it's a remote event. And so there's just a little bit of housekeeping. You'll see on your screen a Q&A, and we would like you to use the Q&A for your questions. These will be correlated, and Ambrosine will present the questions to Richard on your behalf. So welcome then, and I'll just take a little time to introduce our speaker, who I think you can see. If you say hello, Richard, they'll see your face.
Hi.
So there's Richard Landes, and Richard Landes is an American historian and author specializing in millennialism, which is the belief advanced by some religious denominations that a golden age or paradise will occur on earth prior to the final judgment and future eternal state of the world to come. And it's all very complicated, but Richard's going to explain a lot of that to us tonight. So Richard is also the chap who coined the phrase Pallywood. And as you know, Pallywood is the practice of staged filming to create evidence against Israel for the benefit of a Palestinian people. He's published many books and articles, and I'm hoping that I'll be able to put the link to his website on the chat, but if not, just Google Richard Landes and you'll find tons and tons of stuff that he's done come up on Google. So tonight, our topic is BLM, BDS, and the Wokeocracy.
Wokeocracy.
Wokeocracy, the Cogwar 5 years on. 5 years ago, Richard said, "It's not every generation gets the chance to defend a civilization." And he advised us that silence is not an option. So here we are, these 5 years later, and we ask, how have we done? So as I said, Richard was last with us in January before the incredible, extraordinary events that started occurring late January, early February in the world. And so during that time, we've all become quite familiar with words such as COVID-19, coronavirus, pandemic, face masks, Wuhan, ventilators, wash your hands, social distancing, BLM, BDS, cancel culture, fake news, Trump derangement syndrome, and of course, the latest buzzword, woke. Now, I realize that many will be asking, what does this mean? And what does it have to do with this thing called a Cogwar? And this is where Richard Landes comes in. So Richard, let's start with the media and COVID-19. What role has the media played this year in all of the extraordinary events that are still rolling out? And can we look back and find a trail from the past that brings us to where we are today, with fake news and expression now inseparable from President Trump?
Okay, all right. So the first thing I'd say is that COVID has revealed a really worrying series of gaps between, on the one hand, data, and on the other hand, policy, between, the safety of the public and the economic life of the public. And most terrifying, at least in my mind, a gap between what our journalists and their editors tell us and what's actually happening. We don't really know what's actually happening because so much of the information seems so politicized. And this is a tendency that's increased by Twitter mobs and the canceling of so much discourse as racist. So you get to the point where if you report anything that doesn't fit a certain narrative, whether it's a right-wing narrative or a left-wing narrative, you're in danger of being canceled because your information has betrayed what should be the story that everybody's in line with. And this is true all around. Fox, CNN, BBC, France 2. We're dealing with a huge challenge to our civilization, that is COVID. And the information with which we navigate that challenge is strongly tainted. It's like we're fighting a night fight and we're moon blind. Now, what makes it possible, what made it possible for our major legacy media, other people refer to it as the mainstream news media, but that itself is a problematic term. I call it the legacy news media. By that I mean, you know, the major papers, the major news outlets like BBC and CNN. What made it possible for our major legacy media to get so politicized that, at least in America, it resembles the early days of the US partisan press, which was, you know, really, you know, the early journalism in the early American Republic was violently partisan. Modern conditions, however, demand a much higher level of accuracy in reporting than we're currently getting. In other words, professional journalism that's supposed to be committed to accuracy and relevance has become seriously inhibited in providing that by the kind of partisan commitments that have been developing. Now, in my reading, you asked what the background to this. In my reading, this goes back at least 20 years, during which time this has spread on a large scale, and it begins with the legacies media's reporting of the Palestinian Intifada, second Intifada, is starting in October of 2000. And at that point, what happened was a sort of massive shift, and it was even more pronounced in Europe than it was in the United States, but it was nonetheless pronounced across the boards, a massive shift towards a Palestinian narrative. In other words, the sort of the framework, the narrative framework that the press adopted was by and large the Israeli Goliath and the Palestinian David. And in the more extreme versions, it was, you know, the Israeli Nazi and the Palestinian, the new Jew, victim of the new Nazi. And that narrative meant that repeatedly the press would bring in as news Palestinian war propaganda. The case that I studied that led me to coin the term Pallywood was the case of Mohammed al-Dura, this 12-year-old boy who was allegedly murdered by the IDF, deliberately shot, defenseless in his father's arms. I looked at the footage. I looked at the footage before it, the footage after it, other footage from Netzarim Junction that day, and realized that aside from, you know, kids throwing Molotov cocktails and stuff, the vast majority of the footage that was shot was formally staged. I mean, there were sets and there were makeup and there were directors. And I came up with the term Pallywood. And what happened was, here's the Palestinians producing this war propaganda, and here's our legacy media reporting to us as if this war propaganda were true, as if it were news. And that, I think, created, first of all, it happened on a scale that I don't think in the past any sort of fake news had ever happened before. And in some senses, it's still going on today. Both the Adua story in 2000 and the Jenin massacre in 2002, both of which appear in the book that I'm about to publish in the United States, represent exceptional hoaxes in the history of modern journalism, both because of the spread of these lethal memes within the legacy media. It wasn't just one paper that got duped, but it was really across the boards, and their reluctance to correct either their past or their future behavior. The media felt that they were doing the right thing by distorting the situation in favor of the Palestinians, who really don't like criticism, and against the Israelis, who you can insult to their face and they'll take it. So you had this fundamental imbalance, and the media that were conducting this campaign felt fully justified in distorting reality and distorting, in sacrificing accuracy for the sake of narrative. Now, the reporters who conducted this lethal journalism didn't realize that it wasn't just lethal to Israel, but to democracies in general. That it wasn't reporting the war propaganda of one side in a faraway conflict, but actually it was a kind of own goal war journalism in which they were reporting the war propaganda of their own society's enemies as news. Now that is an extremely rare and I'd say highly foolish practice, especially for a democracy. And yet in the Middle East, it's been going on for 2 decades now. And gradually this partisan war journalism invaded domestic journalism. In 2004, just before the US elections, Dan Rather of CBS got caught with a fake letter allegedly criticizing the young George Bush for his service in the National Guard. And he released this just before, and therefore hopefully to tip the election in favor of John Kerry in 2004. When he got caught, the New York Times defended him on the grounds that it was fake but accurate. So, you know, again, we're dealing with the narrative is true, even if the information is false. Incidentally, the same argument was used to reject claims that the Mohammed Adoura footage of the IDF killing Mohammed Adoura was staged. Even if it was staged, it was still accurate, was the claim. And Dan Rather and the New York Times were part of a larger group turning out anti-Bush political propaganda. The Lancet in Britain rushed into publication for the first time in their long history on the website first, in order to publish deeply problematic statistics that accused Bush of killing over 100,000 people in Iraq, again, to influence the elections. And you have the same problem with the coverage of jihad and its relationship to Muslims. The media bent over backwards not to criticize Muslims, not to associate Muslim terror with Islam. For the Obama administration officials, the expression radical Islam was taboo. You got some unbelievable clips and on YouTube of Republican senators questioning Eric Holder, who was the then Attorney General, and another guy who was in the national security, and saying, you know, do you think that radical Islam is responsible for some of these terrorist attacks? And the response is no, absolutely not. Our enemies are Al-Qaeda and other groups like that, but they literally would not say radical Islam. So for example, in 2008, when a Palestinian American major in the American Army went jihadi and massacred dozens of people at Fort Hood yelling Allahu Akbar, the Obama administration insisted that this was a workplace incident and refused to give the people who were killed by him or the people injured by him the Purple Star. Any criticism of Islam was considered Islamophobic, and that accusation was so powerful that, for example, in England for over a decade, no one in authority dared protect British girls from sexual slavery at the hands of Pakistani Muslim men. for fear of being called Islamophobes. That's a huge victory for the caliphators. I'll get back to who they are, in their Cogwar against the West. So by the end of the new century's first decade, what I call the aughts, the 00s, the us-them attitude that had spread through the news media, enforced by cancel culture, bullying, had deeply damaged the information that we get. Trump's election had a huge impact, aggravating the problem. The New York Times, the day after his election, apologized to their readers for having assured them that Trump couldn't win because their narrative overrode their reporting accuracy. But only a couple of days later, they dove right back into even more completely partisan politics in the aftermath. The recent firing of James Bennett and the resignation of Barry Weiss from the New York Times editorial page shows how far the woke mob has penetrated the legacy media. It's a massive shift towards cancel culture's demands. And now with COVID, the situation's no longer even just a bad joke. The rapidity with which various narratives, no big deal, be free, versus big deal, stay home and wear a mask, fell victim to a journalistic agenda that was stunning. If you haven't seen the humor of Canadian comic Ryan Long on the insane symmetries between right and left, watch this. Can we show that clip?
Hold on 1 second.
All right.
Okay, there we go. Share. Bear with me. Sorry guys, I'll be with you in a mo. Richard, you can talk a little longer while I get this going.
All right. So the next comment I was going to make is that in such a world of basically unreliable information from the very sources that are supposed to be professionally providing us with reliable information, conspiracies multiply at the speed of light, with the internet providing petri dish conditions for their replication. Everywhere, people see plots, malevolent intentions, hidden forces working their ruin. And given the pathetically skewed information that we get from an activist journalist.
Richard, are you there?
Yep.
Can you work it for me? Share. Audience, just bear with me while I do that.
Hang in there. This clip is well worth it.
Share your screen. I don't understand that. I'm going to ask you to quit. Don't quit. Okay, guys, you're going to have to hang in there because we've... There we go. No, that's
right.
opened on the screen.
A lot of freelance videographers will sell their footage to either CNN or Fox News. But when you do that, you only get to sell half of what you actually film happening at these events. You might be able to sell your peaceful protest footage to CNN, but then you're stuck with all this footage of looters rioting, which is why I've developed a technique that allows me to sell to both. They call me the chief because I use every part of the buffalo. Well, Fox News calls me the chief. CNN got
no, we can only hear it.
Buffalo.
No, I can't see. Okay, guys, audience, I'm really sorry, but we had a glitch with the computer and I've been unable to do this. If Richard's going to carry on,
you'll see what you can do.
All right. Question.
So anyway, I was just saying, and this is my concluding remarks about the media, is that given how unreliable the information from the media is, not only do conspiracy theories abound, in other words, the people on the right are convinced that the leftist media is lying to them, and the people on the left are convinced that the, Fox is just fake news all the time. In fact, one of the recent things that I just saw was an interview on the street with an American congressman who was asked about the riots in, hold on 1 second, who was asked about the riots in Portland, and his response was that there are no riots in Portland. This is just made up by the media. So even our representatives are swept up in this basically bubble fake news bubble. All right, let's hear Ryan Long.
You see, a lot of freelance videographers will sell their footage to either CNN or Fox News. But when you do that, you only get to sell half of what you actually film happening at these events. You might be able to sell your peaceful protest footage to CNN, but then you're stuck with all this footage of looters rioting, which is why I've developed a technique that allows me to sell to both. They call me the chief because I use every part of the buffalo. Well, Fox News calls me the chief. CNN got offended that a white person used the word buffalo.
Okay, there we go.
All right. There are other good clips in there, but what can I say?
Okay, sure.
All right, Sharon, back to you.
Okay, so you mentioned in that first section the word woke. And woke, of course, is the buzzword of 2020. Some say it's PC on steroids. The Urban Dictionary describes it simply as being aware of what's going on in society in relation to racism and social justice. Please expand on this concept of wokeocracy. Is it a passing phase or the latest millenarian movement?
Right. Well, I'm going to say it's a millenarian movement. And let me give some definitions. I'm going to differ somewhat from your opening definition of millennialism. Millennialism can be religious, but it can also be secular. It's basically the belief that at some point in the future, the world will enter a sort of messianic era of peace and harmony and plenty and mutual love and an end to human suffering. It differs from eschatology, which is the belief that it's going to be the end of the world. There'll be a last judgment, the good go to heaven, the bad go to hell, and there won't be any history. There won't be, we won't be living in the flesh anymore. Millennialism is embedded in this world, in the flesh, and therefore in history, and therefore is much more political than eschatology. And the last term I want to introduce is the term apocalyptic, which I used to mean the belief that whether it's the eschaton, the last judgment, or it's the millennium, heaven on earth, that you're expecting. Apocalyptic believers believe that it is now. It's happening right now. And what I would say is that the woke are an apocalyptic millennial movement that believes that we are on the verge of overcoming all the terrible oppressions that have been weighing on mankind since the beginning, including systemic racism and the oppression of privilege. And if we can just get rid of those and adopt, I'll come back to this, a kind of peace and conflict resolution approach to things, we can actually introduce a world without war. Now, what you've got, so it's an apocalyptic activism, which is largely transformative, although it's becoming more and more violent. In that sense, the woke are a reincarnation of the 60s New Age millennialism, passed through a sort of Frankfurt School academia of tenured failed radicals, weaponized by the internet, and now storming out from their study halls to impose the truth on a sinful and recalcitrant social world of suffocating, systemic, imperial, colonialist oppression. In the late 4th century in the Mediterranean, you had a similar phenomenon in which Christian monks emerged from their cells and cloisters to attack pagan blasphemies, kill their teachers, and burn their libraries. Today, it's done bloodlessly through cancel culture. Woke leaders are all convinced that they've seen the light and know the truth. Racism is systemic in America, where by those standards, is it not? Privilege need to step down and make room for the oppressed. Modern capitalism is bad. Just look at global warming. The Israelis and the Americans are the enemies. Our Islamist and Palestinian brothers are in the same trench against colonial settler genocide and the unbearable racism. And if only we can dismantle this evil empire, the world will be filled with good, simple men like Luke Skywalker and his merry men. It seems absurd, And it's easy to make fun of it. I don't know if you've seen this book, but Tatiana McGrath has a book called Woke, which is basically taking the Mickey out of the woke. But it's also tragically true. We live in a world that's literally shaped by science fiction movies. The two key ones that I'd argue that have deeply influenced the millennial generation are Star Trek's Evil Empire, which via the magic of the Frankfurt School is us, we are the enemy, and E.T.'s Lovable Other. So the them are not dangerous. We have seen the enemy and it is us. So today we privileged white people must oppose the evil us and bend the knee to the just them, or as I put it, their side, right or wrong. Part of the change from the 60s is how much revolutionary behavior today is programmed rather than spontaneous. How much effort is expended manifesting, signaling virtue. It's precisely this virtue signaling that cripples an opposition. As many commentators have noted, the big guys who get attacked, most recently Steven Pinker at Harvard, who just got justice mobbed, they'll survive. The real target of this kind of social justice, mob justice on the internet are the younger people, the people who aren't in positions already of authority from which they can't be removed, the people who don't have tenure, who basically are being told, don't you dare behave the way somebody like Steven Pinker is behaving, and criticize the woke dogmas of the day. Now, the millennial ideology behind this is what proponents in academia call peace and conflict resolution studies, an openly partisan academic field that insists that man is inherently peaceful, that anyone who disagrees is a warmonger. So they go out, Steven Pinker is one of the people who thinks that, humans are naturally violent. No, you can't say that. And anyone who disagrees is a warmonger, that if the techniques of peace and conflict resolution studies are followed, we would be in an era free of war. So alongside gays and feminists for Palestine, there are a few more self-parodying names than historians against war. Up until quite recently, almost all history was nothing but war. It's a secular version of Isaiah's promise, a favorite of early Christian preaching, a source of inspiration for those who created the UN. There's a square, Isaiah Square, right next to the UN. A favorite of the 60s, ain't a gonna study war no more, I ain't a gonna study war no more. And although it may not get fully explicit about its religious inspiration, it's definitely more active than its earlier religious manifestations. When there's no God, people have to build the millennium by themselves. So many people have noted the sort of religious dimension of the wokeocracy. Certainly BDS has rituals of recruitment and initiation. Most of these religious traits, however, are also apocalyptic traits. The division of the world into good and evil, the legitimation of violence for the sake of collective salvation, the enforcement of a dogma from which there is no legitimate dissent. Eric Hoffer, who wrote the book True Believers, a dock worker in San Francisco, but a very smart man, wrote a book called The True Believers, and he noted that mass movements don't need a God, but they do need a devil. And that's the modern privileged whites. Anything to undermine them, including falsifying evidence, is legitimate. Now, the irony here is you've got this transformative, peaceful millennial movement, and who do they pick as their allies? The caliphators. And here I'll go back to my definitions about apocalypticism. The caliphator millennium is the idea that at some point in this generation, there will be a global caliphate. In other words, the entire world will be under Islamic rule, and the world will basically be divided into Muslims and dhimmi, that is, people who are subject to Muslims. Now this, so I define as caliphate, or anybody who believes that, any Muslim who believes that in this generation, they're basically going to take over. It's an active cataclysmic movement. The jihadis believe we are God's instrument in carrying out the necessary destruction for the creation of the global, the perfect society, the global caliphate. And its goal is hierarchical. Muslims rule over infidels. One would think a peaceful woman movement would steer clear of such apocalyptic testosterone, as I put it. But no, we have a marriage of postmodern masochism and pre-modern sadism. As anyone fleeing Islamic theocracies will tell you, they start and accede to power through an alliance with the left, and then they eat them up.
Okay, so there's a new movement that you didn't mention that's broken onto the scene now, and that's the BLM,
right.
Black Lives Matter. And this movement exploded into our lives just a couple of months ago, basically, and it's been embraced by the mainstream as a force for change, acknowledging past injustices served to the Black communities, including slavery, police violence, and discriminatory racism. This movement has been around for some time. So what is the significance of it appearing now in 2020 after this, in this pandemic year, in connection with BDS, because we see the Black Lives Matter and BDS joining horns, so to speak. So how does this tie in with what you mentioned, cancel culture, and what's actually going on here with this movement going on?
Right. Okay, so I think the first thing we have to do is distinguish between Black Lives Matter as a formal organization with a manifesto and a platform, from Black Lives Matter, the sentiment and the movement for social justice that sentiment informs. I think it's unquestionable that no matter how awful a person might be, no one, not even George Floyd, deserves to be treated the way he did. And any attitude that somehow Black Lives Matter less than white ones, or whatever your race is, reflects a level of racial prejudice that most Americans find reprehensible. Of course, that's already a huge step away from the kind of systemic racism one finds in countries like Japan, China, India, Brazil. But in the current atmosphere, one can't even say that. For example, a UN professor had the nerve to want to point out that much of the current anti-racist sentiment comes from the open-mindedness of white editors. So this fellow, his name is Romano, Carlin Romano, took issue with the idea that the publishing business operated with, quote, the full benefits of white supremacy and institutional racism. This is classic woke Black Lives Matter talk. And that, quote, white gatekeeping had been working to stifle Black voices at every level of our industry. This is a statement that he was objecting to. These assertions, he argued, amounted to calumnies on multiple generations of white publishers and editors who had fought to publish authors of color. He said, I resent the idea that whites in this book publishing and literary world are an oppositional force that needs to be assigned to re-education camps. The response was a petition calling on the administration to fire Carlin Romano from University of Pennsylvania. Dear faculty and deans of the Annenberg School for Communication, I write to express my outrage and disappointment over the recent behavior of Carlin Romano, specifically in relation to racist remarks he made in a sustained campaign of targeting Black people and women on the board of the National Book Critics Circle. In other words, the very fact that he criticized these racist accusations against white editors for being a bunch of oppressors, that itself was defined as impossible, unacceptable racism that deserved to get him fired from his job. So from the kind of concern for social justice, the kind of desire to continue to work on getting rid of even unconscious racist attitudes, even what's called microaggressions against forms of prejudice against Blacks, from that to the movement, Black Lives Matter is a huge step, and one that I don't think we should take. Because if you look at the way Black Lives Matter, the movement, rather, or the organization rather than the movement, behave, is their only concern, and the only thing that arouses their outrage is when Black lives are taken by cops or whites. And if reducing police presence and intervention in Black communities means more Blacks, children and women are killed by Black gangs, that is not their concern. Similarly, the link with the Palestinians of Black Lives Matter, the organization, is based on the same twisted logic. Palestinians and their supporters are only interested in Palestinian or Arab lives when Israelis can be blamed. 100 times as many Arabs killed in Syria, Palestinians victims of Lebanese apartheid, not interesting. So BLM actually had a plank in their manifesto, and this goes back to 2015, when they first began, 2014, 2015, accusing Israel of genocide. And in those woke circles, just as it's not permissible for someone to say that whites aren't racists, it's not permissible to say that Israel or whites that Israel isn't genocidal. And ironically, just as you can't defend Israel or whites, you can't criticize Palestinians or Blacks. To say Palestinians teach their children and their people genocidal hatred is inadmissible, even as to say Blacks have their own forms of racism is unacceptable. So right now, Black Lives Matter, the political movement, is using the sentiment Black Lives Matter, which they do, to dominate the discussion, to dox and cancel and expel anyone who doesn't toe the line. There's a formal alliance between wokesters, Black Lives Matter activists, and BDS, i.e. caliphators doing Cogwar, to attack anyone who will stray from the party line. So an allegedly progressive movement welcomes some of the most patriarchal, belligerent folks in the world, caliphators, and blocks participation from the progressive causes to one of the most progressive populations in the world, namely Jews.
Okay, that's kind of heady stuff. There's a lot of controversy about Black Lives Matter, and I'm hoping this connection with BDS and anti-Semitism will come up in the Q&A. So in the meantime, you mentioned virtue signaling and honor shame. So what I'd like you to do now is to sum up these momentous occurrences as a whole in this extraordinary year of 2020, 5 years on from when you said it's not every generation that gets to defend a civilization. And please tell us, have we been silent?
Yeah, we've been silent. I mean, basically what's been happening is that the wokesters, the political activists on the progressive side have seized the initiative. And even though large numbers of people disagree with them, and that includes in academia, nobody is willing to undergo the public shaming and the mob attacks on Twitter and the calls for their being canceled, fired, etc., that would ensue from fighting back. So basically, you've got, on the one hand, some very aggressive people, and on the other hand, a whole range of people who should be speaking out and who are way too timid. So, and that's led us to this catastrophic situation where a deeply sketchy character, I'm speaking here about Donald Trump, upholds basic Western principles, and highly educated and accomplished intellectuals fuel regressive political forces. And I think what's called for is a level of courage that we haven't been willing to express yet. If Roosevelt could reassure the United States by claiming that the only thing we need fear is fear itself, then I'd say that the only thing we need to fear right now is shame itself. And we should be choosing integrity over shame, honesty over virtue signaling, challenge the dogmas, don't let people get away with cheap shots like racism and Islamophobia and white supremacy. So that means that we actually have to engage in fighting back in this cognitive war, which is literally attacking the fundamental elements of Western civilization, whether it's democracy or it's academia, freedom of thought, the ability to disagree publicly without being, literally run out of town on a rail, figurative or not. So yes, I think we definitely need to step up to the plate and fight back rather than say, oh, these people are crazy, nobody's going to listen to them. If we've learned anything in the last, say, 3 months, it's these people may be crazy, but people are listening to them and they're dominating the scene, and the damage they will do is, even if they eventually lose, as most millennial movements do, the damage they do before they lose, it can be absolutely devastating. One of the rules of millennial studies is that wrong, and all millennial movements are wrong because, at least so far, there's no perfection on earth. Wrong does not mean inconsequential. Hitler may have been wrong, but he certainly wasn't inconsequential. And I think that we owe it to ourselves and to the next generations, and the next generations owe it to themselves and to their next generations to fight back.
So we have, it's quite heady stuff and very worrying. So we would like to thank you for presenting that, Richard. We have a few questions in the pipeline, and we've got Ambrosine over there who's going to present those questions to you. Ambrosine, can you do that?
Yeah, I've got some interesting questions about the Democratic primary, the Wokeocracy in the primary. It says here, the Democrats are embarking on the first woke primary, a gauntlet of political correctness that will routinely writing abject apologies out of candidates and find fault in even the most sure-footed, and we can see that from Biden. The passage of time will be no defense. Example, Elizabeth Warren, she stood exposed as implicitly in league with the oppressors of Native Americans, and here she had just wanted Donald Trump to stop referring to her by a nickname, Cherokee Nation. So we can see this coming with the Democratic Party candidates, specifically with Biden. Can you talk a little bit about what's going on there with Wokeocracy?
Right. Well, first of all, this is something that we know from past millennial movements, particularly secular ones like the communists and the Nazis, which is they devour their own. So what you've got is this sort of very active public movement that is insisting on what we might call, what's the word, sort of litmus tests of being on the right side. And they're going to demand things of the Democrats that are going to drive away a lot of people in the middle. Right now, it looks like Biden's doing okay, but it's not clear what the long-term effects are going to be. And the fact that you've got, literally rioting going on in places like Portland, and Democratic representatives insisting that it's not happening, is not going to help the Democrats when the time comes. I think there are a lot of people who are deeply unhappy with Trump, but who are also deeply unhappy with the sort of woke left, and the degree to which the Democrats are driven to the left in order to sort of harness their enthusiasm is going to cost them an enormous amount in the middle.
I think Sharon's gone. So there's another question here with regards to the protesting that we're talking about. We see it in Israel and America on the streets, same coin, same side of the coin, funded by the usual left NGOs. What did they want? Is it what we're reading all the time, a fall of Western democracy? What is it, or something else?
Well, I think that in their minds, they are actually defending Western democracy, and they believe that by their protests and by the implementation of their policies, and with the woke, we have plenty of sort of programmatic statements. We have open letters to places like Princeton University by the woke professors demanding, among other things, that there be a committee to review all publications by professors at the university to make sure that they're not racist, which is an unbelievably intrusive and dogmatic. I mean, it's, you know, I study the Middle Ages. That's inquisitorial behavior. We know from them that they have these demands. Now, they believe that they're actually they're helping make democracy much better than it is now. Democracy, as Churchill said, is a lousy system, and it's a whole lot better than whatever's next, whatever other system you might want, like monarchy. But the fact is that not only do I think their behavior is problematic, but I think even more problematic is the behavior of their behavior in conjunction with the caliphators, so that you end up making an alliance that you think is going to make the world a better place, but you're actually empowering people who have a completely different idea of what a good world is and have no commitment to democracy or human rights or tolerance and empathy for others, but who are committed to their triumphalist narrative in which they are right because they're on top. So yeah, I think that they may believe that they're helping democracy. I think quite the opposite. And the key to it is when they shut down criticism, you know you're dealing with authoritarianism.
Peter McElvenna has asked you, Richard, are we moving towards a time, or are we there already, that if individuals do not sign up to a BLM, BDS, LGBTQ, Islamophobia newspeak, that we will not be allowed to participate in society? People are losing their jobs, access to bank accounts, social media platforms, because their views are no longer accepted by our media. Do you see reason and common sense prevailing, or are we in a permanent state of guerrilla warfare? And that's by Peter McElvenna.
Right. So first of all, I'd say that's definitely what the Wokeocracy would like. They would like to cancel out anybody who disagrees with them, anybody who criticizes them, by insisting that they're racist. And in one case that I studied, I wrote a book on what happened at Connecticut College in 2015 with Andrew Pessin. He was accused of being a racist, and anybody who criticized, who defended him and criticized the use of the word racist to describe him, automatically became a racist. So we're really dealing with a dogmatic formula that has very little to do with reality, and which systematically, you know, the term newspeak is perfectly appropriate. Now, does that mean that they're going to win? I don't know, but to some extent it depends on the degree to which we fight back. As long as we're timid, and as long as we let them get away with their aggressions, As long as we accept, for example, that an accusation of Islamophobia should end somebody's career, then they are going to win. Are we in a permanent state of guerrilla war? No, but are we in a long-term condition of this, I call it a cognitive war? Yeah, we've got a long haul ahead.
Frank Bagel, can anything be done to restore the trust between the Black Americans, the Black community in America, and the mainstream Jewish community, bearing in mind the days of Martin Luther King Jr. and J. Lewis?
Well, that would be nice. And look, I remember I was 18 in 1968. No, 67. I was 18 in 67. So, you know, we were swept up in the movement for civil rights and so on and so forth. And I saw it literally break up with the radical Black move. And there was a lot of good connections between Jews and Blacks at that time. I think there are still a lot of good connections between Jews and Blacks. I would say that one of the key issues here is the ability of people to be self-critical. Jews are, like, in my term, what's the word I use? They're Olympic champions of self-criticism. The Black community has people who are willing to be self-critical, but these are people who are largely being marginalized, people like Tom Sowell and Candace Owens and so on. So I think that, you know, one of the things that's going to come out of Black Lives Matter is that, you know, the police presence in these communities is going to be lessened. Ultimately, I think the policies of the movement Black Lives Matter, the policies of defunding and, in fact, dismantling police are going to make the life of actual Blacks in America much worse than they are now. And as a result, I think we may even see a sort of rebellion within the Black community. And if that happens, the Jews are the natural allies of the people who rebel against this kind of woke, dogmatic, revolutionary movement.
Douglas Alzabeth from Imtetsu. When I first met Sharon and Ambrosine, Britain had just voted for Brexit. The lesson was that the people were not being candid. The point is that this attitude is applying in geometric fashion now in the US. There is actually a decent chance that the fighting back you are rightfully calling for will be happening at the ballot box. By the way, the Palestinians said that the IDF was racist precisely because they refused to rape Palestinian women.
Actually, that last point, let me correct you. It's not the Palestinians who said that. First of all, they accused the IDF of raping Palestinian women. But it was an Israeli graduate student who wrote a thesis for Hebrew University and got an award for it, who insisted that the Israelis were racist because they didn't rape Palestinian women. But the larger question is, I think, true. I think the fighting back is at the ballot box, but in a sense, that's why Trump got elected. But the problem is that it just made the problem worse. In other words, we don't need this to devolve into a fight, what I call the internalization of the clash of civilizations, in which on the one hand, you've got, you know, sort of redneck Americans backing Trump almost as a messiah figure. On the one hand, and a bunch of, you know, self-destructive, masochistic intellectuals on the other, convinced that, you know, they should be running the world, and that these awful people, these deplorables, as Clinton called them, should just go away. So I really think what we need is intelligent voices that can stand up for basic decency and for the ability for people to handle criticism without going ballistic and either crying or striking back because you have harmed me or you have endangered my life. You know, the claims are actually quite stunning.
Douglas just, Sharon, just a moment. Richard said, Douglas said, Richard is right about the HU student making that charge.
Right.
Yeah. Over to you, Sharon.
Okay, so we have another question, Ambrosine, and it's on the chat. I don't know if you want to pick it up or if I should pick it up.
Yeah, you can. It's fine.
Okay, I'll pick it up. This is from Richard Galba. And what he says that I started rereading Tom Wolfe's Mauve Gloves and Madmen, written in the 1970s. One paragraph says, children come to university today and they register and they get their cards, etc. And they get a packet of cultural and political attitudes. That these attitudes, care, negative or cynical, don't seem important. Or these attitudes are negative or cynical, don't seem important. The student emerges with a set of ready-made, intact, untouched by direct experience. This could be written today. Any comment, Richard?
Well, not only could it be written today, but I mean, I went to school, at least in the early 70s, and I certainly didn't feel that way. And, you know, to have him describe this going on in the 70s is, you know, the fact that he perceived that already is quite striking. But today, absolutely. I mean, but that's what I meant when I made those references to sort of the Frankfurt School critical theory combined with a kind of neo-Marxist, in which you end up with, I call it Y2K mind, because it really sort of seized a hold of the Western intelligentsia in the year 2000. And I define Y2K mind as, when jihadis attack a democracy, blame the democracy. And that's what happened when the jihadis attacked Israel in the Second Intifada. Israel got blamed. And when the jihadis attacked America in 9/11, America got blamed. Now, not immediately and not everybody, but over time, the dominant discourse was, what have we done to make them hate us so? And nobody was allowed to say, this is the reason they hate us so, because they have an ideology, a genocidal imperialist ideology in which we are their enemies.
So this is a bit of projection in a way, that they're projecting that onto us.
Oh, absolutely.
That's the imperialists and et cetera, et cetera.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the stunning thing. So in 2006, after the Lebanon War, you have Judith Butler, who's sort of the queen of queer theory and critical theory, etc., who is asked if the Hamas and Hezbollah belong as part of the global progressive left. And her response is to say, absolutely. And why? When she was asked to clarify why that was the case, she said, because they're anti-imperialist. And what she didn't understand is they're ferocious imperialists. They're anti-American imperialism because it's their rival. But she is so focused on American imperialism being the boogie monster that she has to destroy, which, by the way, is the very boogie monster that made her career possible, that she embraces literally what she says she's against.
Okay, so something very heady to ask you. With the onset of Black Lives Matter now, and when I asked you, is there a trail backwards? And
right.
What is it, and if there is a connection between the BLM movement, I'm not talking about Black people, but the BLM movement, with going back to Nation of Islam, Black Power, Bader Meinhof, the Weathermen, all of those, going back to, I guess, to the 1950s. Is there a progression that's brought us to today, or is it totally disconnected?
No, it's not disconnected. I mean, when I first started getting into the idea of cognitive war, and I didn't get a chance to define it, cognitive war is essentially the war that those who are conducting an asymmetrical war against a much more powerful enemy have to do first. They can't win on the military battlefield. So first they have to use cognitive war to deploy their forces more favorably before they can resume an actual military combat. And essentially, as I began to think about the cognitive war that the caliphators were waging against the West, I realized that really the earlier example of this was the cognitive war that the communists waged against the West. Right? Russia wasn't in a position to conquer America, but it was in a position to try and undermine America through a whole series of principles, and through what they called useful idiots. So I actually published an article called "From Useful Idiot to Useful Infidel." And there are intellectuals today who are useful infidels. They are tools. The journalists who report Palestinian war propaganda as news are essentially tools of the jihadi warfare against their own culture. So there's definitely continuity, and part of it has to do with this sort of enormous appeal in Western civilization of radical ideas. We love radical ideas. I actually think this goes back to the Jews, who has very radical ideas, including aniconic attitudes that, you know, you shouldn't do images or statues of God, which is a very radical idea. And that kind of iconoclasm appeals, and that's why I got interested in millennialism. It's a well-intentioned desire to make the world a whole lot better than it is. And you know, that we have this expression, the way to hell is paved with good intentions. That's certainly true of millennialism.
Richard, just one last question that struck me as well is you were talking about caliphators and this global caliphate. We're living now in extremely extraordinary times where we see China very much in the news. And I read the other day that of this link through its bridges and road policy, China is now embracing Iran in a very big way and looking as though it might be stepping in to take the place in economically where America has withdrawn from Iran. Tell me how in this connection of communism, socialism with Islam, with an Islamic ideology, what's the fallout going to be there when, well, hopefully they won't achieve it, but if they ever get to a stage where democracy has been defeated, what's the fallout between these two extreme ideologies?
Well, you know, it's hard to predict precisely. I mean, one of the most stunning developments recently is the ferocious treatment of the Uyghurs, Chinese Muslims, by the Chinese regime, and the stunning silence from the Muslim world. I mean, can you imagine if the Israelis were to do this to their Palestinian population? That would justify comparisons with Nazis, but nobody's comparing the Chinese with Nazis. In fact, it's hard to even find them condemning it. So the behavior is so bizarre that I don't think you can predict. I mean, certainly, you know, if you talk to Iranians who went through the revolution of 1979, which in the Muslim count was the year 1400, if you talk with them, they'll say, you know, we were communists, we allied with Khomeini, and then when the revolution happened, Khomeini took over and threw us all into prison. So there are plenty of people who will tell you that when the communists unite with the caliphators are going to win. But, you know, China is a huge country. I mean, we're talking about 1 billion Muslims and 1 billion Chinese. I wouldn't like to see them go head to head. You know, one of the things that kills me about this hostility to American hegemony is there has never in the history of mankind been has there been a power that is so vastly superior militarily to everybody else, and which has used that military power so sparingly, has left so much room for others to express themselves. Now, you know, you talk to the French and they'll say, oh no, we're suffocated by American hegemony. And after 9/11, one of their most famous sociologists, Baudrillard, said, well, the jihadis did it, but we wanted it. Because, you know, no hegemon like as powerful as the United States shouldn't be kicked in the you know what. So, you know, I think it would be a catastrophe to have, it would be a catastrophe to all progressive causes to have American hegemony fall and to have, you know, Chinese and Islamic groups be some of the dominant forces in the globe.
So, Richard, with that, we're going to leave that heady thought for the audience to take home with them. We're always happy for anybody who wants to be in touch with Richard to please contact us and we can put you in touch. As you can see, Richard's very magnanimous and very happy to share his views and ideas and discuss and teach. We've always found him an incredible friend and a very informative man. So we want to thank you so much, Ambrosine and I, she's still there in the corner. We want to thank you so much for spending this time with us and apologize for any glitches in the system. We had hoped to share this all over social media, but didn't manage to do that. But hopefully I see the record button going. So hopefully there'll be a video that we can share afterwards with you and with the audience and whoever else wants to watch it. We're hoping you'll come back with that last question, give it some thought, and we can have a sequel, maybe get some solutions before the American election.
All right.
So with that, would you like to say something?
Yeah, just thank you to everyone watching. I think what we'll do is we'll do a little host party on Facebook and we'll put it up and it can play continually. We'll have your face continually, Richard, on Facebook.
All right. All right, send me the link and I'll send it to my friends who weren't able to show up.
Okay, well, we'll do that. We'll share it widely. And thank you to the audience and thank you to my husband for helping us with this technology. Okay, guys, there's a chat here. Let's have a look what the chat's saying. Saying thank you. David Lewis, thank you, Sharon, Ambrosine, and Richard for a very illuminating webinar. So if you want to put your thanks up there, you're welcome to, and we'll pass them on. They'll be recorded anyway, and we can pass them on to Richard. But we're going to say good night. We're going to end the webinar, and shalom to all.
Shalom.
Thanks for joining.